This is a story set in Boston Harbor during a zombie outbreak, a port lockdown, a blackout, a network collapse, and a supply shortage, and I am a cold storage dock manager trapped inside a waterfront freezer warehouse, trying to hold the freezers, the dock doors, the diesel, the food, and the staff together until an official safe corridor opens. The first time I died, I did it beside a cracked pallet lane under the loading canopy, with a clipboard in one hand and my radio clipped to my belt. I had worked nights in that warehouse for almost 6 years, long enough to know every sound it made. The dock shutters rattled when the wind came off the harbor. The freezer compressors hummed in 2 different pitches, one for the lower cold rooms and one for the blast chill corridor. The mezzanine office had a thin echo because the walls were paneled, not poured. The smell in the building changed by floor. Salt, fish, wet cardboard, diesel, frost, old coffee, and the dry metallic breath of cold air that had been pushed through the same channels for too many winters. That mattered, because my job was to keep seafood and produce from spoiling. I tracked deliveries. I signed temperature logs. I checked the dock seals. I watched the diesel gauge. I knew which freezer door stuck if the humidity rose, and which lift gate had to be nudged twice before it would latch all the way. I did not know the city from the windows as well as I knew the warehouse from the alarms. On the night I died, the harbor already felt wrong. The first warning came through the port radio on the desk in the dock office. 2 violent patients at the waterfront clinic. A ferry delay. A request from security to keep the terminal entrance clear because somebody had bitten a transit guard in the waiting hall. At first, it sounded like one of those bad nights that happens once every winter and then gets remembered too long. Then the details got worse. Another screaming patient. An emergency evacuation on the harbor shuttle. A shaky phone clip from a terminal concourse that showed a man in a winter coat throwing himself at a glass barrier like he wanted through it more than he wanted air. I remember hearing the shouting before I saw anything. It came from the loading lane behind the south freezer. Somebody was yelling for help. Somebody else was yelling not to open the hatch. I knew the voice of the man who called out because he was one of the forklift drivers who always came in early and complained about the cold. He sounded terrified. I should have checked the camera first. I should have looked at the corner through the window before I moved. Instead, I stepped out of the dock office with my keys in one hand and my flashlight in the other. The service hatch at the end of the pallet lane was already open a few inches. The yellow strip light above it was flickering. I could hear boots on concrete. I could hear someone crying inside the freezer corridor. I thought maybe one of the truckers had slipped. Maybe a driver had been cornered. Maybe it was one of those ugly nights where the harbor gets too loud, too wet, and too tired, and everybody mistakes panic for an accident. Then the infected came around the stacked crates. I remember the face more than the body. Gray skin, red-rimmed eyes, frost on the shoulders of a work jacket that was soaked through. Its hands were reaching before its feet had finished moving. I remember my own radio hissing against my belt when I hit the pallet edge and lost my footing. I remember the clang of my clipboard hitting the concrete and the stupid, unreal way the sound echoed in the lane. Then my heel skidded on a patch of thawed ice. My shoulder hit the loading rail. The door opened wider than it should have. The infected got enough room to grab me, and the world narrowed to metal, breath, and the hard certainty that I had trusted a voice before I checked the angle. When I woke again, I was sitting in the dock office with a half-cold cup of coffee and the wall clock reading 5:18 a.m. I did not move for almost a full minute. The radio on the desk was humming with a weak alert. A truck was reversing outside. Somewhere in the warehouse, a fork truck beeped once and stopped. The monitors were on. My hands were clean. No blood. No bite marks. The date on the receipt printer told me I was 1 week earlier than I should have been. I checked it twice. Then I checked my phone, the camera feed, and the logbook on the desk. Same harbor weather. Same dock noise. Same world, but before the worst turn had landed. Not a dream. Not a seizure. Not a fever. A second chance. I did not know why I had it. I did not spend time arguing with it. I had already seen the ending once, and that was enough to make the morning feel like somebody had loaded a rifle in the next room. By 6, I was counting the warehouse like inventory. The loading dock had the main gate, the south hatch, the freight bay, the security booth, and 2 pallet lanes that ran directly into the cold rooms. The freezer corridor sat behind a pair of insulated doors. The reserve room held dry goods, spare parts, and the extra cases of frozen product that had to stay above a certain threshold. The generator room sat behind a steel door near the rear wall. The mezzanine office looked down over the whole dock floor, which meant it could see trouble coming before the floor could. I knew all of it because I had spent years moving through it with scans, seals, and temperature logs. That knowledge was the only reason I had any chance at all. If the harbor locked down, then the dock office, the freezer corridor, the reserve room, and the generator hall would be the only places that mattered. Everything else would be either a rout or a trap. I wrote that down on the back of a supply form and started a list of what I needed if the city went bad before the week was out. Food first, water first, medicine, batteries, light, tape, trash bags, markers, a pry bar, spare gloves, blackout fabric for the office windows, anything that could hold a door, slow a person, or keep the freezer from losing its temperature too fast. By 7, I had my badge on and my cart loaded. I started with the warehouse dry goods because I knew exactly what was there, and because the assistant manager owed me a favor, I was ready to collect. I took sealed crackers, instant oatmeal cups, canned soup, peanut butter, tuna packets, powdered drink mix, coffee, tea, and a stack of plastic bowls and spoons that were meant for the staff break room. I did not take anything that needed a freezer. I did not take anything that I could not count by hand. Then I moved to the side supply cage and loaded bottled water, electrolyte packets, granola bars, and 2 boxes of juice pouches that were technically meant for the break room fridge but would become useful if people started making bad decisions under stress. At the harbor market across from the terminal, I found half the shelves still full and half the customers already too nervous to pretend it was normal. One man in a wool coat was buying cans of beans like he expected a storm to stay for a month. A woman with 2 children had filled a cart with bread, apples, rice, and bottled water. She looked ashamed of the volume of what she was buying, which meant she had already crossed the point where shame mattered less than preparation. I kept my list small and my movements boring. At the pharmacy end cap, I bought fever reducers, pain relievers, anti-diarrhea tablets, antihistamines, adhesive bandages, gauze, tape, gloves, masks, alcohol wipes, thermometers, and antiseptic. I added a small bottle of iodine and 2 packs of saline flushes because I had learned long ago that the boring supplies disappear before the dramatic ones. At the hardware counter, I bought batteries, 2 LED lanterns, 3 headlamps, a pry bar, duct tape, zip ties, a utility knife, a hammer, a folding cart, a box of padlocks, and a roll of heavy plastic sheeting that would be useful for blocking glass. The clerk asked me if I was preparing for a blizzard. I almost said yes. Instead, I told him winter always changed fast on the waterfront, which was close enough to the truth to keep him from asking anything else. When I got back to the warehouse, I did not take the elevator. I hauled the first load up the stairs to remind myself where the weak points were. That was a mistake I knew better than to make, but the feeling of the building under my boots mattered. On the second landing, I stopped and listened. I heard the dock gate. I heard the cooler fans. I heard a truck pulling out on the street. Nothing was broken yet. That was the worst part. Disaster always feels late until the exact second it arrives. I spent the rest of the morning turning my office into a room that could be defended. The mezzanine windows got blackout fabric first, then tape around the edges. Then a shelf moved in front of the lower panes so no one could see movement from the street. I put the flashlight, radio, notebook, batteries, and knife on the desk where I could reach them without standing. I taped a harbor map to the wall and marked the dock gate, the rear service door, the freezer corridor, the generator hall, the reserve room, and the route to the roof access. The dock office became the core zone. The freezer reserve room became the supply zone. The pallet lane nearest the dock gate became the buffer zone. The service hatch at the south freezer became the line I would not cross unless I had to. I had just finished the labels when Mara Quinn knocked on the dock office glass from the freezer side. She was the refrigeration technician on night shift, and she had the kind of tired face that only people working around compressors and alarms seem to develop. She held up a temperature printout and a small paper cup of coffee. I opened the office door only enough to let her slide the paper through. She asked me if I was hearing the same reports she was hearing from the harbor clinic. I told her yes. She told me that a patient had bitten a security guard at the ferry terminal, that another had turned violent on a shuttle platform, and that the clinic was already asking staff to avoid the waiting room unless they had to cross it. She did not sound like a gossip. She sounded like somebody reporting an alarm. I asked if she thought it was infection. She looked at me and said it was too ugly to be anything else. That was the first time I heard another person say the exact thing I had learned by dying. I told her I was going to secure the dock and freezer room before the day got worse. She told me that if the lights went out, the freezer corridor would become a trap, because people would panic inside the cold and start making stupid choices just to move faster. I wrote that down on the back of the temperature sheet. By late afternoon, the news tone shifted. At first, the alerts were careful. Temporary ferry delays, a request to avoid the terminal, cargo disruption on the harbor side. Then the language got flatter and sharper. Stay inside if possible. Conserve power. Delay non-essential travel. Expect disruptions in communications and delivery. The bars on my phone flickered, then dipped, then came back weak enough to feel insulting. When I carried the last cart into the dock office, the building already felt different. Not the weather, the building. The corridor noise had thinned into a tense quiet. The freight elevator had stopped making its usual low hum. Voices from the street were muffled and too distant to trust. Down in the generator hall, a relay clicked once and then stayed silent. I was finishing my count sheet when the first flicker hit. The dock lights blinked, then blinked again. Then they stayed dim just long enough to make the whole warehouse feel like it had shifted an inch to the left. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert before the signal disappeared. Stay indoors, avoid the waterfront district. Reports of violent incidents and communications disruption. Shelter in place if you can. That was the official language. The meaning was much simpler. The city had started to let go. I moved on instinct. I shut the office door, dropped the chain, and shoved the pallet jack sideways so it blocked the line of sight from the lane. I pulled the blackout fabric tighter over the windows. I dragged the water cases closer to the desk. Anything that could be used as a barrier had to be near enough to use before fear changed its shape. Then I listened. The warehouse spoke in layers once the main power failed. Compressors wound down somewhere in the walls. A freezer fan gave a long, tired click. The elevator shaft settled with a low metallic groan. Doors on the dock line opened and shut. Somebody outside shouted for a driver to move his truck. A child cried once and was hushed. A man by the side gate kept repeating that his wife was still inside the terminal. The emergency strips came on a few seconds later, weak and amber along the floor, enough to keep people from tripping and not enough to make anybody feel safe. I heard Hector Alvarez before I saw him. He was the diesel mechanic and dock maintenance lead for the warehouse, a broad-shouldered man in a stained work jacket who always looked like he had already fixed 3 problems before breakfast and expected 3 more after midnight. He came through the generator hall with a ring of keys and a flashlight in one hand, and he looked at the deadened dock office as if he had been waiting for this exact hour. "You got fuel enough?" he asked. I said yes, but not enough to waste. He nodded once and told me to keep it tight. The harbor radio came on after that, weak with static. Power failures. Road closures. Terminal restrictions. Then a second voice, calmer than the first, said the port should prepare for controlled lockdown if the situation worsened. I looked at Hector. He looked at the freezer corridor sign. Neither of us liked how neatly the pieces were fitting together. The first pounding on the loading gate came just before dark. Not the dock office door, the outer gate. The sound rolled through the warehouse like a drum hitting concrete. Somebody shouted from outside. Another voice answered. Then a third. A metal crash rang out from the south freezer hatch, followed by the wet, dragging noise I remembered from my death. I did not go out to check. I did not open anything. I stayed in the office with the pry bar on the desk and the flashlight turned low, and I listened long enough to know the difference between panic and impact. Someone hit the gate once, then twice. A woman cried out for help. Then the voices broke apart into running feet, shouted names, and the ugly silence that comes when a corridor becomes a trap. That was the moment the warehouse stopped being my workplace and started being my bunker. Near midnight, Mara called me on the internal line from the freezer side. The connection was weak, but her voice made it through. She asked if I could hear the dock gate on my side. I said yes. She told me to keep the freezer doors shut and to stop anybody from opening the service hatch unless they had a second person verifying the route. She said the infected were moving in the port corridors now, but not all of them were moving fast. Some were still upright enough to reach a door or a landing if they got lucky. One weak person in a narrow space could still kill you if you trusted the gap. I had already learned that once. I told her I was going to keep the dock closed. She said good. Then she asked whether I had extra bottled water, because the cold rooms were already seeing a pressure drop in the staff sink line, and the wash basin in the reserve room was starting to run brown. I sent 2 cases through the pass-through with Hector 30 minutes later. In return, Mara sent me a box of masks, a bottle of antiseptic, and a note written in the neat block letters she used for temperature tags. Watch for fever, confusion, red eyes, unsteady walking, sudden aggression. I pinned the note over my count sheet and left it there where I could see it. The next morning was not really morning. It was just a gray thinning in the light through the dock office fabric. The power had not returned. The elevators were dead. The harbor shuttle announcements had gone silent. Somewhere in the building, the generator had kicked on for a few seconds, then settled into a hesitant cycle that sounded too weak to trust. The smell in the warehouse had changed too. More wet concrete, more stale air. Less of the clean industrial scent the cold rooms usually had, and more of the smell of a place starting to hold its own waste. That was how I knew the water problem had become real. The taps still worked if you waited long enough, but the pressure was thin and uneven. One sink in the break room spit brown water for 2 seconds before clearing. A toilet near the locker line made a hollow gurgling sound and refused to refill properly. Hector swore softly and said the booster line probably could not hold pressure if the upper levels kept pulling at the same time. I began separating clean water from everything else. Drink water in one corner, cooking water in another. Wash water in the break room sink with a labeled bucket beneath it. It looked obsessive until the warehouse got worse. Then it looked reasonable. Mara came to the dock office in person the first time after the blackout and stood in the doorway with her flashlight clipped to her collar and the tired expression of someone who had spent the last 12 hours trying to keep the freezer alarms from making everyone crazy. She asked how much water I had left. I told her enough for 3 days if I stayed disciplined. She nodded and said that was better than the break room upstairs. Then she gave me the first real medical list I had heard since the outbreak started to turn its teeth toward us. Watch for confusion. Watch for unsteady movement. Watch for red eyes and sudden aggression. Do not mistake fever weakness for safety. The infected could still climb a stairwell, cross a landing, or follow a sound even when they looked half gone. I asked her how many people in the building had symptoms. She said enough to make the crew nervous, and not enough to make the floor safe. That was the sort of answer that told the truth without pretending to be comfortable. We both went quiet for a second after that. There was nothing else to say that would help. After dark, someone started pounding on the loading gate from the outside. At first I thought it was a trucker who had not gotten the warning in time. Then I heard a man shouting through the grill for us to let him in, because he had a sister on the mezzanine, and the street was full of people running. 2 seconds later a second voice joined him, and then a third, and I realized it was a small group of strangers who had found the warehouse because warehouses are where desperate people think answers might still be sitting in a rack. Before I could answer, something hit the outer fence hard enough to rattle the chain. I moved to the camera monitor and looked through the grainy feed. A man in a torn harbor jacket was stumbling along the curb with the stiff, wrong gait I remembered from my death. Not fast, not coordinated, just wrong enough to make the people at the gate scatter. The group outside began shouting at one another. One wanted the gate open. One wanted to run. One said there were more coming down the street. Then the infected reached the fence line, and that was all the argument the night needed. The people outside fled. I did not open the gate. I did not run after them. I hit the manual lock, dropped the chain across the inner gate, and pulled the pallet jack into the line behind it. Hector shoved a supply cart into place on the opposite side. The whole line held because we made it hold, and because panic is often enough to make people create the exact confusion that kills them. After that, I wrote new rules on the harbor map. No one opened a door alone. No one used the freezer corridor as a shortcut. No one crossed the dock lane if they had not been checked by somebody else first. No one borrowed reserve supplies without writing it down. No one answered a voice at the gate if the person speaking could not be seen in full light. Mara approved every one of those rules through the freezer window. Hector grunted at them and said I was starting to sound like a man who had already seen the bad ending. I did not deny it. By the end of the first 2 days, the warehouse had become smaller, not physically. The building was still huge, but the useful parts had narrowed. The dock office, the reserve room, the freezer corridor, the generator hall, the mezzanine break room. Those were the places that mattered now. The rest was either a route to somewhere safer or a place to avoid. That was the shape of the first crisis. Close the door. Count the fuel. Listen to the gate. Keep the supplies together. Do not trust noise. Do not trust the first story the harbor tells you about itself. Outside, sleet kept falling on Boston Harbor. Inside, the warehouse started becoming a place you could only hold if you accepted its limits. That became clearer on the third day, when Hector took me down to the generator room. The room sat behind a steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Inside, the air smelled like hot metal, old diesel, and dust baked onto wiring by years of use. The backup generator was larger than I liked. It sat in the middle of the concrete floor with fuel lines, transfer switches, and a panel of blinking indicators that looked too cheerful for the amount of trouble they were hiding. Hector crouched beside the side cover and pointed out the fault relay that had tripped when the blackout hit the port grid. "If we can get one more clean cycle out of this unit," he said, "the freezer bank stays lit, the dock gets power, and the radio keeps talking. If not, we are doing this in the dark much sooner than I want." I handed him the flashlight and kept the beam on the panel. He did not waste words. He opened the cover, reseated a contact, and showed me the manual bypass for the one line most likely to fail again. I held the light steady and stayed out of his way. That was the real work. Do not invent a better plan than the man with the wrench. Do not touch the wrong cable because you think confidence counts as training. The generator shuddered when he restarted it. Then it held. The lights over the dock came back to life in a weak, useful strip. The corridor behind us stopped feeling like a cave. The harbor radio on my belt picked up a stronger signal. It was not a victory. It was just one more hour we had bought. I wrote the repair in my notebook and added the fuel level beside it. That was how the days started to work. One count at a time. One system at a time. By the fourth day, the water pressure began to fail in a way that was too obvious to ignore. At first, it was a thin stream from the sink in the break room. Then the toilet near the freezer corridor stopped refilling properly. Then one of the taps in the locker room spat air and brown water before clearing. The smell changed first. Cold warehouses are built to hide smell. When they fail in the nose before anywhere else. I put a bucket under the break room sink, labeled it clean water, and divided everything else into strict categories. Drink water, cook water, wash water, emergency water. It looked obsessive until the warehouse got worse. Then it looked normal. Mara started leaving notes in the pass-through slot because she did not want to rely on the phones if the network collapsed completely. Her notes were brief and exact. Watch for fever. Watch for confusion. Watch for red eyes and sudden aggression. Do not mistake exhaustion for safety. A weak person in a narrow corridor can still kill you if you trust the gap. She was right, and she knew it. That evening, she came to the dock office in person. She was wearing a mask, a headlamp clipped to her collar, and the expression of someone who had spent 12 hours trying to keep frightened people from panicking at the same time. She asked me how much water I had left. I told her 3 days if I stayed disciplined. She nodded and said that was better than the crew room upstairs, which was already rationing cups by shift. Then she handed me a box of gloves, a small bottle of antiseptic, and 2 packets of saline flushes. I gave her bottled water and a case of crackers. Neither of us smiled. We did not need to. That exchange mattered because it showed where the trust line sat. We could help each other. We could not pretend the building was safe enough for generosity without boundaries. The first real infection pressure inside the warehouse came on the 5th night. Someone started pounding on the service hatch from the loading side just after midnight. At first, it sounded like a dock worker in a hurry. Then I heard a voice asking for help in a tone that was too strained and too close to the door. A second voice called out from farther down the lane not to open anything. Then came the wet, dragging noise I remembered from my death. I looked at Hector. He looked at the camera feed. On the grainy screen, a man in a torn harbor coat was standing wrong in the lane. His shoulder was soaked. He kept rocking forward and back in short, stiff motions. Not fast. Not coordinated. Just wrong enough to make the hair on my arms rise. The man hit the service hatch once with his palm, then again. I did not open it. I did not send someone to check. I used the camera, the peephole, and the intercom that still worked for the dockside, and that was enough. The infected man drifted off after a few seconds, drawn by noise from deeper on the street. Someone outside shouted. Then another sound broke out, louder and worse. The harbor was starting to turn into the same kind of funnel I had watched kill me before. That night I changed the posted rules. No one crossed the dock lane alone. No one used the freezer corridor if the route was unclear. No one opened a door for a voice. No one borrowed reserve supplies without writing it down. Mara approved all of it. Hector grunted and said I was starting to sound like a night supervisor. I told him the supervisor was dead or unreachable and that I was fine with either answer as long as the doors stayed closed. By the 6th day, I could smell the sanitation problem before I saw it. The toilets were filling too slowly. The break room sink had begun to spit brownish water on the first pull of the handle. The freezer corridor smelled like damp cardboard and old bleach, which was never a good sign. Trash bags were piling up faster than the warehouse wanted to admit, and the waste chute was no longer a place anybody wanted to stand near for long. I put absorbent material in the waste bin, lined it with 2 bags, and moved it into the far corner of the dock reserve room. I set out a roll of paper towels, a box of gloves, a bottle of cleaner, and a marker so nobody had to guess what to use. It did not solve the smell, it just gave the smell a container. Mara came down once to check the temperature of a shipment that had started warming in the reserve room. She did not ask me to come with her. She asked if I had any extra batteries for the handheld thermometers and whether I could spare one of the LED lanterns for the freezer room because the overhead light there had failed for the 3rd time. I gave her both. She gave me something more useful than gratitude. She told me the crew had started seeing people who were not technically workers yet. Family members who had arrived to check on relatives. Stranded truckers. A delivery driver who had been in the wrong place when the terminal shutdown started. Every one of them believed the warehouse was the safest point in the district. That made the place more crowded and less safe at the same time. We both understood the math. The base was strong only if the traffic stayed controlled. That is why I agreed to the supply run on the 7th morning. We needed more antiseptic, more fuel stabilizer, 1 more box of masks, and a replacement battery pack for the radio. The inside stock could last a little longer, but not forever. Hector wanted to go with me because he knew the harbor routes. Mara wanted us back before the afternoon because the crowd near the dock gates was getting harder to manage. None of us liked the idea. That was exactly why we did it. We left through the loading gate at first light. Boston looked interrupted. Sleet had turned the streets into dark gray mirrors. Traffic lights blinked uselessly over empty intersections. A city bus sat crooked in the lane with no driver in sight. 2 delivery scooters were tipped on their sides near the curb, as if someone had dropped them and never come back. The sidewalks were wet, scattered with paper cups, loose flyers, and the kind of debris that builds when a city stops telling its people where to go. We moved by side streets and service alleys because the main roads were already too full of abandoned cars. The first pharmacy we checked had its front glass shattered and a handwritten sign in the window that said limit 1 per customer in the deadest handwriting I had ever seen. The shelves inside were not empty yet, but they were close enough to make me slower. Empty shelves mean somebody got there first. Half-empty shelves mean somebody else will be back. I took antiseptic wipes, iodine, pain relievers, anti-diarrhea tablets, adhesive bandages, a pack of gloves, and 2 boxes of masks. Hector found a rack of batteries in the wrong aisle and grabbed every package that still had a seal on it. At the back of the store, we heard a crash from the stockroom door. Both of us froze. The second sound was worse. A dragging noise. Then a low moan that rolled through the aisles like a piece of bad weather. We backed out instead of trying to be brave. I learned a long time ago that the smartest thing you can do in a half-empty store is leave before your nerves decide to argue with your route. On the walk back, we passed a man in a harbor maintenance vest standing beside an abandoned wheelchair in the sleet. He looked at our bags and asked if we had extra water. I told him no. He did not look angry. He just looked tired enough to stop caring whether truth was polite. Then he said there were people gathering near the warehouse gates because they thought the building still had power and food. That was the first time I realized the dock would become a target from both sides at once. The pressure came that evening. First it was a fist on the loading gate, then a shouted request for water, then a woman crying that her brother was upstairs in the terminal office and needed help getting out, then another voice, male and sharp, demanding to know why the warehouse was hiding supplies when the harbor was on its knees. I stayed behind the dock glass and watched shadows move across the outer fence. There were about 6 of them, maybe 7. Too many to trust. Not enough to surrender to. I told them through the intercom that the dock was sealed and that nobody was being let in from the street. The man shouting at the gate called me a coward. I did not answer. Then the infected appeared at the far end of the block. Not a crowd. Just one at first, stumbling in the sleet with the stiff, wrong motion I had already learned to fear. The people outside saw it and split apart at once. One ran. One tried to drag the woman with him. One stood frozen long enough to make the wrong choice and then bolted the other direction. The infected did not sprint. It just kept coming. I hit the gate lock and pulled the pallet jack in tighter. Hector shoved the supply cart into place. We did not go after the people running down the block, and we did not open the gate for anyone who had just learned what the sound of fear does to a crowd. That night, Mara came to the pass-through with a fresh note from the harbor radio board. The city had announced partial lockdown around the waterfront district. Road access would be controlled. Movement would be restricted. Emergency corridors were being discussed. She read the note once, then looked at me and said the warehouse would become more crowded before it became safer. I believed her. The next 2 days were about holding the line. I kept the dock office organized by counts, water on one shelf, food on another, medicine in the middle, batteries in a separate box, clean gloves on top, dirty waste sealed and moved out of the main path. I wrote down what we used, what we lost, and what was left. Hector kept the generator cycling. Mara kept the temperature notes moving. Between us, the warehouse still behaved like something managed. Outside, the city got worse. The radio lost pieces of itself first, then whole stretches. The news tone became clipped and uncertain. Power failures hit more neighborhoods. Transit shut down. The Harbor Corps was described with the kind of language officials use when they are trying not to admit how bad a thing has already become. On the 9th day, the radio finally spoke clearly enough to make me sit down. An official corridor would open the following morning, narrow and supervised for the harbor district. There would be a movement window. Identity checks, escort lanes, controlled exits. The announcer said people should pack only what they could carry and wait for verification. I did not feel relief right away. I felt suspicion first. Hector felt the same. He stood by the generator room door and said if the corridor was real, it would still be real in the morning. Mara came down with her own bag already packed and the face of someone who had stopped hoping for anything that was not tangible. We checked the roofline. We checked the street through the dock cameras. We checked the emergency alerts against the harbor radio. We compared notes on infected movement, crowd size, and which blocks were still dark. We did not trust the announcement just because it sounded hopeful. The corridor held. It held through the first quiet hour. It held when the generator shifted into a lower hum and the building seemed to settle around it. It held when Hector came up from the basement with his wrench in his back pocket and told me the fuel line would last the night if we were careful. It held when Mara brought down the last temperature check from the freezer room and said the confused worker was finally drinking water without being told twice. That was the easy part. The hard part was the waiting. The evening before the corridor opened was long enough to change the shape of every sound in the building. Sleet kept tapping the loading canopy in a steady line. The generator kept its rough, stubborn rhythm. The dock office smelled like hot dust, coffee gone stale, and the cleaner I had used on the floor around the waste bin. Somewhere up in the terminal office, a worker was crying in a voice too weak to sound angry. A cartwheel squealed somewhere in the corridor and then went quiet. I used the calm to do one more sweep of the basement and the dock lane. The reserve room still held the stock. The food labels were still in place. The water cases were still stacked against the wall in clean rows. The dark corners held nothing important. The path from the dock office to the gate and from the dock office to the freezer corridor was still simple enough to run in the dark if I had to. That was the point. The building did not need to be pretty. It needed to be predictable. Predictable did not mean quiet. The warehouse had started making its own small sounds, and by then I knew enough to listen for all of them. A drip near the utility sink, a scrape from a loose panel on the reserve room rack, a short burst of static from the harbor radio, the bump of a cartwheel that had not been parked quite square. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. I went back down the freezer corridor before I let the numbers lie to me. The overhead light had failed again in the far hall, which meant the portable lantern Mara had given me was doing most of the work. The cold air hit my face when I opened the inner door. It always did. The blast freeze room held its temperature better than the rest of the building, but the corridor still felt wrong when the lights were low. Edges looked too sharp. Shadows under the racks looked deeper. Every sound from the boots on the metal grates seemed to echo twice. At the back of the reserve room, I found the leak I had feared and hoped not to find. It was small. A seam in the wash line under the sink, just enough to drip into the drain pan and spread a dark patch across the concrete. Small leaks become bigger problems in buildings like this because cold keeps water from evaporating quickly. It sits, it creeps, it makes the floors slick. It gives a person one more thing to forget while they are trying to think about everything else. I called for Hector, and he came with a wrench, 2 towels, and the face of a man who would have preferred a larger emergency because larger emergencies are at least honest. We shut the valve, laid the towels down, and moved the lower boxes back from the wall so the water could not travel under the shelving. That work took 15 minutes. It felt longer because the whole warehouse had started to measure time by interruptions. When we finished, Mara was waiting in the dock office with a clipboard and a tired look in her eyes. She said the worker in the reserve room had finally stopped asking the same question every few minutes. I asked which question. She said whether the corridor was really coming. That made me look at the radio. The radio was still dirty with static, but now and then a clean phrase came through. Controlled movement. Harbor district. Medical checks. Delayed departures. Stay at the marked lane. 1 person per escort group if necessary. It was never enough to be soothing. It was enough to be real. Mara leaned on the office frame and said the worker had answered the temperature checks correctly, which was a better sign than any speech could have been. Then she added that 2 other people on the mezzanine had started talking louder about the corridor because they thought the word itself meant rescue. I told her people always hear the part they want first. She gave me a look that said she had already guessed I would say that. They hear the exit, she said. They ignore the rules. That was exactly right. I went up to the roof access door after that because I wanted to see the street for myself. The harbor looked stripped down from above. Barricades glowed at the far intersection. A line of reflective vests moved in pairs. 1 portable floodlight had been set at the corner near the checkpoint, and it turned the wet pavement into a flat silver strip. That was all. No heroics, no miracle rescue. Just a managed lane through a city that had finally accepted that fewer people die when movement is controlled. I stood there long enough to see a woman with a duffel bag and a child in her arms get guided from one lane to the next without being shoved or rushed. That was the moment I knew the corridor was not a rumor. It was a route. Routes were the only kind of miracle I trusted. When I came back down, Hector was at the generator room door checking the fuel gauge. He said the line was holding but running warm. I asked him how warm was warm. He shrugged and said warm enough to remind him we were still borrowing time. That was one of the better ways he had ever described anything. Mara was down in the freezer room with the worker who had been shaky earlier. She came out a few minutes later with a fresh note in her hand. The note said the fever had dropped again. The confusion had not, but the man was beginning to answer questions with less delay. She had written a second line beneath it. If the corridor fails, keep him in the room with the blanket and water. Do not let him walk the dock alone. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. That was the thing about the last days of a disaster. Nobody was asking for grand choices anymore. They were asking for the next safe room, the next clean cup, the next time they could sit down without letting the building win. The crew on the mezzanine started making noise again around midnight. Not panic. Just fatigue and worry and the kind of anger that comes from standing in one place too long. One man kept insisting his sister should move with the first corridor group because she had a cough and should not be waiting any longer. Another said the first group was already too full and that if anyone shoved their way into the line, the whole escort would slow down. Mara handled it the way nurses handle things that are really only about fear. She gave them a list. Who was moving first? Who was staying back? Who had a child? Who needed medication? Who could walk steadily? Who needed a wheelchair? The list looked simple on the page. It was the most useful thing in the room. I wrote the same structure into my notebook because copying good order is sometimes the only way to keep it alive. There was a final noise from outside around 2 in the morning. Somebody on the street side banged on the outer fence and shouted for the warehouse to answer. I moved to the camera and saw a man in a harbor security jacket with one sleeve torn and a flashlight pointed down. He was not infected. He was cold, wet, and furious. He demanded to know why the building would not open its gate to a family trying to get to the escort line. I told him through the intercom that the dock was sealed until the next movement call. He yelled that the city had been saying that for hours. I told him I knew, and that yelling at the gate would not make the lane wider. Before he could answer, I saw movement behind him at the edge of the streetlight. One infected figure. Then another shape farther back. He saw the first one and started backing up toward the fence instead of away from it, which was exactly the wrong motion and exactly the sort of thing fear makes people do when they want a door more than they want a map. I did not open the gate. I did not call him back. I watched him run around the corner while the infected kept moving along the sidewalk, slower than a person and more dangerous because of it. Hector came up beside me and said the harbor was running out of patience. I told him it had been out of patience before we noticed. He gave a short laugh that had no humor in it, and then went back to the generator room. That was the last long stretch before the corridor opened. After that, everything got narrower, quieter, and more honest. Hector stood by the generator room door when I came back, wiping his hands on a rag that had already stopped being clean. He said the upper floors were getting nervous again because somebody had heard the word corridor and decided it meant immediate rescue. I told him people always hear the part they want first. He nodded once. They hear the exit. They ignore the rules. That was exactly right. One floor up, Mara was trying to hold the freezer crew together with a half-empty medication cart, a clipboard, and a patient's reserve that had to be close to gone. She came down to the dock office around midnight to check the worker in the reserve room again. She did not ask me for help. She asked for clean gloves, a fresh mask, a thermometer, and 2 bottles of water. I handed them over through the pass-through. She told me the worker's fever had dropped, but his confusion had not. He answered questions too slowly and kept looking toward the hall as if he heard someone speaking his name. That was not good news. It was just better news than a violent turn. She leaned against the wall for a second and said she had not sat down in 7 hours. I gave her a chair and let her keep the room side of the pass-through closed. We talked in short pieces because long speeches were a waste of energy. She asked whether I had enough water to make it through one more day. I told her yes. She asked whether I had enough food for one more night. I told her yes. She asked whether I had a plan if the corridor announcement turned out to be a mistake. I said yes, because I did. The plan was simple. Hold the dock, hold the freezer, keep the gate shut, keep the stairwell checked. If the corridor did not hold, then we were still inside a building with supplies, light, and a few rooms we understood. If the corridor did hold, then we would leave in daylight and not pretend the rest of the city had healed. That made her nod once. That is the first good plan I have heard all week, she said. I did not tell her how much of it came from dying once already. There was no point. Near 2 in the morning, the loading gate took another round of pressure from outside. This time there were no voices at first. Just the slow, wet scrape of something bumping the metal fence and the occasional knock that could have been a hand or could have been a shoulder. I moved to the camera and watched the grainy street view until I made out the shape of a man in a harbor visitor badge hanging from his neck by one broken clip. He was not infected. Not yet. He was trying to get through the gate because he had seen the reflective vests near the far block and thought we were already clearing people out. I told him through the intercom to step back. He shouted that his mother was inside. I told him I could not open the dock. Then he said he had been outside for hours, that the city was full of bodies, and that if the warehouse wanted to pretend it was a fortress, then it should at least have the decency to answer the door. The anger in his voice was real. That was the worst kind. Real anger gets people killed because it feels like momentum. Before I could answer, something moved behind him in the sleet. An infected figure came into the edge of the camera light from the side street, walking with that same stiff, wrong pattern I had learned to fear. The visitor saw it and ran toward the warehouse fence instead of away from it, which is what panic does when the brain wants a door more than it wants a map. I did not open the gate. I did not call for him to stop. I watched him disappear around the corner while the infected kept moving on the sidewalk, slower than a human and more dangerous because of it. Hector came up beside me and said the city was out of patience. I told him the city had been out of patience before we noticed. We spent the rest of the night doing the same small jobs again. Count the batteries, check the water, re-tee the chain, move the waste bin farther from the desk, wipe down the pass-through frame, refill the lantern, tape one edge of the blackout fabric that had started to curl, make the useful things easier to reach and the dangerous things harder to touch, Those tasks are boring when nothing is wrong. When the world is falling apart, they are how you keep the clock from becoming a liar. At about 4 in the morning, I went up to the roof access door for one last look at the block. The air outside was cold and wet. Boston looked thinner from above, like a sketch of itself drawn in black water and streetlight reflections. Barricades glowed at the far intersection. A line of emergency personnel in reflective vests moved along the street with practiced slowness. A few figures waited under awnings on the opposite corner, too far away to make out clearly. No sirens, no gunfire. Just the steady movement of a city trying to arrange its own panic into something usable. I could see the corridor lane from there. It was narrow. It was bright. It was real. That was the first time I let myself believe the next morning might actually happen. When I came back down, Mara was waiting at the pass-through with her bag zipped and her coat on. She said the worker in the reserve room had finally stopped shaking and had started answering questions normally. I asked if that meant he was safe. She said no. It meant he was better. Safety was something else. Then she looked at me and said she would never like warehouses less than she did that night. I almost laughed. Instead, I just nodded. By dawn, the corridor was still open. Emergency workers were visible from the dock camera. The street lane held. The reflective vests moved in pairs. The barricades were still in place, and the people crossing the block were being counted one at a time. That was enough. I packed only what fit in one bag and one folding cart: food, water, antiseptic, 2 flashlights, spare batteries, the radio, my notebook, a clean shirt, the pry bar because habits die slowly. Hector said the warehouse would hold for now. Mara said the same, then touched 2 fingers to the frame of the pass-through as if marking the line between one kind of life and another. We did not celebrate. There was too much fatigue for that. We stood in the dock office for one last moment, listening to the generator hum, the sleet on the loading canopy, and the faint, distant movement of people being guided into the corridor outside. I checked my bag again because I did not trust the shape of it. The flashlight sat where I could reach it without digging. The batteries were wrapped in a plastic sleeve so they would not rattle. The notebook was flat against the side pocket. The clean shirt was folded tight enough to survive the trip without catching on the pry bar handle. That sounds small. It mattered more than small things usually do. At the pass-through, Mara was dealing with one last problem that had nothing to do with infection and everything to do with timing. The woman with the duffel bag from the upper floors had finally accepted that she would not be moving as part of a big family cluster. Her brother was being sent with her first because he could walk steadily and carry her bag if she needed both hands for the stroller. The child she had been worried about was already with another nurse farther up the hall, wrapped in a blanket and half asleep. Mara explained the split in the same tone she would have used for temperature readings. One person now, one route, one decision at a time. The woman did not like it, but she heard it. That was enough for the moment. Hector came up from the generator room and said the radio had stayed clean for almost 10 minutes, which was the closest thing to a blessing the warehouse had heard all week. He also said the corridor workers were asking people to stay in the marked lanes and stop crowding the loading end of the block. I told him the crowd would obey for about 5 minutes, and then start acting like a crowd again. He snorted and said that was generous. The final hour before movement opened in earnest felt like the inside of a held breath. The generator kept humming. The sleet kept tapping. The lights stayed up. The waste bin stayed sealed. The loading gate stayed locked until the workers outside signaled for the next group. But the building itself kept shifting under the pressure of people who were ready to leave, and people who were not ready to be left behind. Somewhere above us, a man started shouting about a lost phone charger and had to be quieted by 2 nurses and a security guard. Somewhere near the terminal office, a baby cried long enough to wake 3 tired adults and then went quiet once the bottle was found. Somewhere in the basement, a cartwheel had to be retightened because somebody had shoved too much weight onto it. Those little noises stacked up until the whole warehouse sounded like a machine with too many loose screws. I went back down the basement corridor one more time to make sure the leak from earlier had not returned. It had not. The towels were still holding the edge of the floor dry. The valve stayed shut. The rack was clear. The dark corner held nothing important. The route from the dock office to the gate stayed simple. That was the real goal of all the checking. Not control, familiarity. Familiarity is what lets you move through a bad place without wasting energy on every shadow. When I came back, A security volunteer from the lobby side asked whether we had one extra wheelchair for a man with a twisted ankle who could not make the curb outside. We had one. Of course we did. There was always one more small problem at the end of a crisis. That is how disasters make you tired. They do not only attack the big systems. They fill the corners with minor needs until you start to wonder whether exhaustion itself is one of the symptoms. Hector wheeled the chair up while I watched the corridor monitor. The street outside was getting brighter by degrees. Not sunny, just visible enough to make the barricades look real, and the people walking between them look like they were moving on purpose. Mara came down the hall with her bag over one shoulder and told me the upper floor was ready. She had already written out a list of who was moving first and who was staying back until the next wave. That list was clipped to her clipboard with a red pen through the top corner. I looked at it and saw the thing I had been trying to build all week. Structure. Not comfort, not safety. Structure. The woman with the duffel bag was crying without making much sound, which was somehow harder to hear than if she had been shouting. Her brother put a hand on her shoulder and told her they were moving in the right order, which was about the best version of courage I had seen from anybody not wearing scrubs. I passed Mara one of the water bottles from my bag, and she gave it back after taking 2 mouthfuls because she said she needed the bottle to keep moving. That was the sort of practical selfishness hospital work teaches you to respect. At the dock desk, the radio gave one more clean announcement. The corridor remained open. The next check-in point was active. Movement through the lane would continue until midday. I wrote those words down because I wanted the day to have proof. Then Hector and I moved the last of the spare batteries to the front shelf, not because anybody needed them immediately, but because leaving useful things behind a stack of boxes always made me uneasy. If the warehouse had taught me anything, it was that the easiest way to lose something in a crisis is to tuck it away one layer too deep and assume you will have time to remember where it went. By the time the worker in reflective vest called for the next group on the street outside, the warehouse had become almost orderly. Almost. That was enough. Mara touched 2 fingers to the edge of the pass-through frame again and said she would see me on the other side if the line held. I told her I planned to make the line hold by walking through it slowly. That got the smallest smile out of her. Hector handed me my pack and told me not to drop the pry bar because he was tired of hearing me talk about habits as if they were a religion. Maybe they were. It was easier to believe in a habit than a miracle. We stood there for one last breath while the generator hummed behind us, the sleet beat on the loading canopy, and the warehouse around us finally sounded like a place that had done enough work to survive its own bad week. Then I walked back through the freezer corridor one last time. The reserve room looked smaller than it had a week ago. The food was still stacked. The labels were still on the bins. The water cases were still where I had set them. The dark corners held nothing important. The path to the exit stayed simple. That was enough. At the outer gate, an emergency worker checked my wristband and pointed me into the marked lane. The street air hit my face first. It smelled like sleet, wet asphalt, and smoke from somewhere I could not see. It also smelled like movement, which was the first clean thing I had breathed in days. I looked back once. The warehouse stood behind me with its dark windows, its repair lights, and its freezer rooms full of the things that had kept us alive. Mara was still inside. Hector was still inside. The building was still dangerous, but it was no longer the only thing standing between me and the city. That was enough to make my next breath come easier. I walked into the corridor with my bag in one hand and my cart in the other. For the first time since the reset, I believed I might actually make it to the other side.